was great there was that it was a good process. It was comprehensive. A lot of good information came in. The plan was readily accessible to anybody who wanted to read why it was important, how it fit in, the recommendations. You know, it was very sort of typical of what you would expect about, you know, here's the list of things to do. But what was different about this one was it had a small constituency, even though it's a community-wide thing. But we had a harbor master that took it and looked at it and said, okay, so this is what my job is for the next, you know, 5 years. And so I didn't realize it at the time, because it takes a little perspective sometimes to understand and appreciate that, but it had dedicated staff time, someone whose sole responsibility is to manage dredging and piers and think the waterways and, you know, equipment and public safety in that way. He was operating with autonomy because he was the harbor master, and he had money because
it's difficult for a planner to implement the plan after it's been completed, and there's a lot of different reasons. The primary one is resources, and a lot of the small and medium-sized towns, there's just one planner, and there isn't really the capacity to really latch onto a series of the recommendations and move them forward. So having some ongoing continued support from MAPC, particularly if they were involved with developing the plan, would be really helpful. And they can provide technical resources that the communities don't have, and assistance going forward to help build that consensus. And there are different groups. There's the municipal officials that Keith referenced, and then there are the citizens that you want to get involved, and together you have the energy to move forward with getting the funding and implementing the recommendation. But it would be really helpful if there was a long-term relationship from the very beginning, from planning right to the end of the process.
Thanks. And to me, it just said how important it is to make sure you're tapping into the visioning part with the community leadership. That is the key to success, I think, for implementing plans. It's the rare one that has a large enough planning staff to deal with all of its issues from within and on their own. That the norm is that we don't have enough in-house talent, and that the budgets are small, and so we need to tap into a greater resource and to people that can help us solve problems, especially where those problems go across boundaries.
Using, in contrast, our open space plan, there was nobody responsible for it. We didn't even have a planner. There was no money. There were no programming, and everyone just, you know, just was like, "That's nice," and it goes on the shelf. So, just to give a little distinction between some of the key, what I think are key elements to moving it forward.
At the outset of a project, it's really hard to try to determine what the final recommendations are going to be when the planning process ends. So in most cases, we're not thinking about how we're going to implement the plan, because it's a step-by-step process. And when you start a project at the outset, you don't know what the recommendations are going to be. You don't know how you will fund those recommendations, whether it's going to be through a budget appropriation or a grant. And prioritization of whatever the recommendations for that project or plan are, you haven't figured that out either. And so it's really hard at the beginning to be thinking about the end. And oftentimes, if it's something like developing a master plan, it could be a 2-year process. So you really don't know where you're going to end up in a couple of years.
I had time to think. So the plan takes a year, let's say, a year or two. The community organizing after the plan takes like 5 times as long.
Exactly.
And it's just like to be more, make that, it's invisible, to make it more visible, that piece. The plan is 1 year, but we're in year 5 of the strategic action plan. It's been way more work to do the community organizing after the plan. And it has to be a marriage. You need both parts.
It's not quite on point. My favorite part of the whole episode was when we were on the floor of town meeting with the zoning, and someone who had not been engaged, a member of the audience who has not been engaged in the process, asked a question, wanted us to water the whole thing down, and I had citizens standing up and saying, no, this is what we want. This is the plan that we've come up with. And we want to adopt it in the form that that MAPC has done for us. So the critical part, though, was having the buy-in from the selectmen, the elected planning board, the town management, so that it wasn't simply the town planner tasked to do a project on her own, that it was a top priority of the community, and I think that's how you implement plans.
So, and also as a resident primarily, and I'm on the school committee too, so I have the political role now, but is that I have license that you don't have, right? I can say things more frankly that you can in certain ways, and that's important too, to find that right person, that right group for the community organizing.
You cannot go to town meeting and expect that everyone has paid attention, that everybody cares, or that everyone will listen and hear the value of what you're proposing. Many people just go, they're there because you're spending money and they're skeptical and they don't trust government. Or even when you're sitting in your selectmen's meeting, who comes and sits in the room, or even town meeting to some extent, it really is 100 people that will decide, you know, a $45 million budget. I mean, it's really 100 people. It is a silo. There are 10,000 people live in Hull, 100 people decide. And so I think how you get beyond into networks of people that are actually very engaged. I mean, the Chamber is one, Rotary Club, Boosters, the faith community, your social services in our community, that's Wellspring. You know, there's all of these different networks of people that are working on important things, but it's also community groups and neighborhood associations. And I think part of our challenge on the South Shore has always been that engaged people step forward, but it's always the same people.
I think town meeting, and because there's not great local news, it comes down to reputation. So a lot of people are voting at town meeting based on your reputation, and so that is just that's the path that it follows.
Think of how many
they rely on reputation.
Think about how many of you in this room have been walking into your polling stations and have texted somebody and said, "Who do I vote for school committee?" Think about that. That's exactly the problem: is who are the influencers and who gets to say. So
and no real news source.
Yeah, no real news source. Yeah. More challenge though is how you push people like me as a selectman to engage with those groups, and I think that's where, when I see the work being very successfully done, there was recently MAPC did Hull's a zoning change plan, and I don't know what was different about how you guys initiated that, because I'm not a selectman anymore, but I'm telling you, you had people in the room on that I never see at town meeting, that I never see at selectmen's. And part of that was important because then when you do walk into town meeting, you've already asked all the questions. So I can say, all right, Ann, great, I understand why you're asking that question. In fact, 20 people asked it, here's the answer. And so what you do is you build a narrative around it where there's a trust that all of it's not just like a because everybody in town thinks it's a backroom deal. They think it's cheap. It all happens on public television, it's not a backroom deal. But they think because there is that thing, and it is a hard nut to crack, and you're not local. So it's going to be your skills on pushing people like me who don't necessarily think outside the box how to do it.
Many of the plans we're talking about, some of the most significant ones are not the ones that a town does for itself. It's the one that the towns do together, and that the MAPC helps us with through the subregions. And in Magic, it was transportation, housing, climate, stormwater. There were an endless number of projects that we worked on together, and many of those happened because of, at least in that sub-region, because of the mix of people around the table, that the Magic leadership included the town administrator, selectmen, elected planning board members, planners, that it was, and I think we were most effective when we had that broad cross-section of people, that it wasn't, pardon not meaning to offend, that it wasn't just a room full of planners, that it was where it was a mix of different roles within the community, that that was a good formula for success.
At the end of the day, not all regions collaborate or connect, and there's a lot of reasons why. I mean, that happens. But I think the question is, how do you overcome the barriers to get them at the table? And I do think the sub-region is a great opportunity. Planners are in the room with other planners. Peer pressure is real. It works. But it's also nice to connect at sort of the decision-making level with selectmen, because we always want to be relevant, and so we always look to see what other people are doing well, and what we think we can manage on our own. And in fact, we do a lot in our region together.
Acton is the lead community. In the case of regional housing, Hudson was the lead community, and I didn't have to solve all the problems from within with my small town staff. I could, by working with others and being supported by MAPC, we could figure out solutions.